Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Redo Meyer. I'm a developer advocate on the Android Developer Relations team, and I'd like to welcome you all to this week's Android Developer Hangout. This week, in celebration of the launch of the new design site at developer.android.com/design, we have some of the members of the Android UX and design teams here with us. So I will let them introduce themselves as we go down the couch.
Hi, I'm Nathan Strew. I'm a visual designer with the Android team and worked on the design style guide with Jens here.
Hi, I'm Jens Nagel. I'm an interaction designer on the Android UX team and was mostly responsible for patterns and copyright.
We also have Kirill, who's online as well. If you want to introduce yourself as well quickly.
I'm Kirill. I work on the Android Market client, and we've spent something like last half a year making one client for different form factors. So I'll join for the relevant questions.
Perfect. Thanks for dialing in. So we've got a bunch of questions on Moderator. I've posted the link to that as well. So if you do have more questions, please add them to that. We'll also be taking questions from people who get into the Hangout. So if you're in my extended circles, you should be able to join us and ask some live questions as well. Before we get started with the questions, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask the experts a little bit more about Android design. So if you've had a chance to look at the Android design site, which I hope you guys all have, there's a creative vision which talks about creating apps which enchant me, simplify my life, and make me amazing. So I'd be interested to know from you guys' perspective, what does that mean to you? Like, what is it you hope people take from this design site and use to build their apps?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Well, one of the primary goals in setting out to do this style guide was that Android had never really provided developers with this level of guidance, or nowhere near this level of guidance. And so one of the biggest challenges in our ecosystem is making sure that our developers are creating applications that are quote unquote less worthy, or that have that level of polish, that have that level of refinement that a lot of consumers are used to seeing perhaps in other platforms. But at the same time, we knew we needed to get something out there. This is the first phase of the Android design. It's going to be something that continues and grows as we go, but ultimately the goal is just to create better experiences on Android as a whole, and I think with Android design we're one big step closer to that.
Nice. And in regards to those three core principles that you mentioned, you'll see other principles in the following chapter, and see that those actually break down into other UI principles. Those are relatively broadly stated, but the nature of a style guide is that it can only give you guidelines. Right? So ever so often you will move off the beaten path, and we hope that the UI principles help you to keep the most important things, the spirit of Android in mind, and make good design decisions based on that.
Nice. So it's really about creating a guide that not only gives the specifics on how to create things our way, but how to understand the philosophy behind what creates Android.
Exactly. And we've been using those guidelines quite extensively as we designed Ice Cream Sandwich. So those came actually out of user research that we did for Gingerbread and user interviews. We did quite an extensive set of user visits at home to see how they use Android in context. And so these kind of core principles distilled themselves out of the results that we got out of the user research. And
so it's all based on sort of real-world experience, seeing how users use their phones and their tablets, and trying to present that in a way that developers can take advantage of all the hard work and research.
And during the development, we actually do make our design decisions based on those principles. So we found them very helpful for us, for ourselves, and hope that they're also valuable for other developers out there.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions we've got on Moderator. Now, I've had a look at some of these already, so I should warn you guys that anything that's a question of the form, when will something be released? We won't answer. And anything of the form, are you planning to do something? Probably also won't get answered. So that's just by way of warning in terms of what we're going to be able to talk about. So let's have a look at the first question. How will using the new Android UI design guidelines work with older non-ice cream sandwich versions of Android? Will the UI elements that we use work in earlier Android versions, or will we need to use different UI elements?
Thank you.
So there are certainly UI elements, such as, for example, the action bar that is, very exclusive to ICS at this particular point. Then there are other building blocks that existed before Ice Cream Sandwich. So if you look at the style guide in general, most of the recommendations that we make, are actually geared towards Ice Cream Sandwich. And I don't know if you can say something about the compatibility.
Yeah,
that we support there.
I think that a lot of the patterns that we talk about, we've already had, I guess, a compatibility story for them. One of the major ones that was recently introduced, I guess, is the swipe views pattern, and we've had View Pager around for some time now that helps implement that. And in terms of things like the action bar, the action bar is probably, I don't want to say it's the most important, but I'd say it's in that list of some of the most important patterns, and that's been around for some time, so users will really understand how to use the action bar. I'd say that the first app that used the action bar was around in 2010. So for 2 years, Android users have been getting kind of very, very accustomed to the action bar. So things like that are already users are already going to understand how to use. Swipe views, those are very natural, and we provide support for that in the compatibility package. So I'd say that in a lot of cases we do already do some of the things there. In a lot of other cases, things like contextual action bar, there isn't a very simple way to do it. On pre-ice cream sandwich devices. At the same time, users may not understand or be really accustomed to it, since it's not kind of built into the core OS. And in those cases, there are good compatibility, I guess, fallbacks. Context menus have been around for a while, and it is possible to use something like a context menu if you absolutely need it on, say, Froyo devices or Gingerbread devices. But if it's possible, if it's really easy to do, if you find that it makes sense within your project, then try to use the new patterns.
Next question. A lot of recommendations regarding the use of swipe gestures, quick action pop-up, etc. It takes a lot of effort to implement some of these. Are there any plans to standardize it and include it in the framework library, or at least the support library? That probably falls into the category of questions that we can't answer based on the fact that you're asking about if and when we will be doing something in the future. What I would say is that we do want to make it easier to do things like this. And so trying to get some of the more common UI paradigms and UX paradigms and bundle them into the framework and potentially the support library makes a lot of sense. And certainly we've done that with things like View Pager in the past. So I think really it comes down to figuring out which of these paradigms stick, which people are using, and figuring out the best way to implement that moving forward. Does that make sense to you guys? All right. Before I move on to the next question as well, I just want to not remind folks, but ask folks. At the moment, we still don't get a lot of analytics data based on finding out how many people are watching. So if you are watching, if you could +1 the stream so that we can have a vague count, that would be really useful. Next question. Is there work being done to backport the Holo themes in ways that make sense for all the versions of the platform, i.e. like Market and Google+? Platform statistics make it hard to commit fully to the Holo design language since you need to design it twice. So without necessarily commenting on the backporting stuff, what advice would you guys have for people who want to build an app, make it use all the cool Holo stuff, but then still be consistent when they are building for people which are going to have phones which go a lot further back than Ice Cream Sandwich?
Well, it's a tough question. I think that, in general, you have to look at, and this is a very general answer, I'd say. We have to look at, who your users are, right? the Holo theme, some of the styling, it's very dramatically different from the previous incarnations of Android, where we had plastic-looking buttons and kind of that kind of the different styling. We've changed that dramatically. So I mean, just taking Holo and applying it to your apps on Froyo devices, it may not be the best thing. But at the same time, if it fits in with your styling, maybe that's you can integrate that as part of your app styling. So there's no real simple answer there. At the same time, I think it'd be a good option to present users, to present developers. If you want to have a single single app style across all devices, regardless of what platform they're on, and you've decided that you want to start with Holo, then I think that one of the best things that we could do is provide that. Whether or not we will be able to provide that, that's it's still an open question, but it's definitely something that we've thought about for sure. Is providing maybe we can provide a backport of Holo or something, but it's definitely not trivial. It's not a trivial problem. So.
In terms of the overall sort of styling and UX, would you guys sort of recommend using the same guidelines that we have here? Like not necessarily the visual stuff, but in terms of gestures and that sort of user experience. Does that make sense to be consistent, basically going as far back as they can implement?
I think, like Roman said, it's a very complicated question, and it depends on the audience. It also depends on your product. If you've got something that's existed in the marketplace for quite some time, you've got a lot of users, and you've got sort of customer familiarity with the interface or the Froyo Plus things. I think if you're kind of kicking off a new effort or you're going through the process of redesign, I would recommend taking the most current thinking and build upon that. I think we're at a much better place for doing more interesting things in the platform. So like Roman said, I think it just depends on the developer, what sort of project you're working on. Using the framework elements, whether you're using Holo or not. You can create a lot of inconsistencies, but with compatibility going backwards, you'll have a lot of, like you said, Roman, plasticky buttons. Like if you're using a framework spinner in Honeycomb versus a framework spinner in Froyo Gingerbread, you're going to get a much different look and feel. So I think it really does depend on where you're coming from as a developer, what your product story is.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. I think we give much the same message to developers on the tech side, whereas if you've got an old product with a lot of legacy users, it makes sense to keep the user experience consistent and even the implementation consistent. Mm-hmm. But if you're starting from scratch, like target the newest SDK, all the cool new stuff there, and figure out how to make it work as far back as you want to.
And there's also, I think you can also be tactical about that. I think there's areas where you could say implement an action bar. You could implement a swipe view without necessarily overhauling your entire look and feel of your app. You could start thinking ahead about, okay, what things in ICS can I start pulling back that make sense, and what things make sense to stay the same. And I think we agree that having consistency in your experience is a huge thing.
I think as well, because you tend to have that audience of users is going to start shifting towards the newer stuff. And so it's not always worthwhile spending a huge amount of development effort to make something look consistent all the way back, just for it to sort of drop off the bottom of the list.
Yeah, and also from my perspective, from developing the market client, we have a pretty wide user base. It was interesting that we have introduced some of the Honeycomb and ICS features visually, some of the visual language back into Froyo and Gingerbread, also to provide kind of a guiding path to make the users feel at home when they do upgrade to newer devices. So it doesn't feel completely out of place on older platforms. So you have to find a certain visual balance, how to represent your content in a way that doesn't feel completely alien on older platforms. So that would be the kind of the task for your visual designers and also the UX designers.
I see, that's a really good tip. Okay. The next question is it's from Joshua in Orange County. And he asks, under the new design guidelines, the right-pointing caret on line items is considered inconsistent with the platform. What other means do you suggest for emphasizing that a list item is clickable in cases where the user may not expect it to be?
So yeah, that guidance has created a couple of a bit of feedback as far as I could see on the internet as well. So the right pointing caret, as we see it, it's basically iOS language. It's not inherently the right pointing caret in itself is not inherently bad if used in the context of iOS. So they established a particular language for their UI elements that they consistently use, and then it makes sense. Android has never used right-pointing carets, and the style guide says, don't use them in order not to make your users wonder what those right-pointing carets are for. You have to see that in the context of us not using the right-pointing caret, right? So we're using just a different language. And what you can do in order to emphasize that an item is not clickable, so for example, if you go to System About Phone, there are a couple of line items in there that are actually not clickable. They're purely informational, and we render them as disabled. And that is something that you can do in order to distinguish active items from inactive items, or drill down items from purely informational items.
And just to follow up on that, I think in the iOS case, in the right-word-facing arrow, not only is it that affordance, but it also kind of plays into their animation transition pattern, where not only is it showing directionality, but it's also giving a cue that this is where the content is going to be coming in from. Their animation and their transition sort of supports that. And I think it's worth mentioning that in many list views, our users are accustomed to list views being inherently tappable or actionable unless otherwise specified, in the case that Jens gave, where we have a disabled text class in that view. So by default, we, I think as users, know that in those contexts, those items are clickable unless otherwise specified.
In general, I just want to reiterate the point that users, when they first get their device, when they first buy a Galaxy Nexus or whatever device, they don't have many apps installed. They'll have apps like like Gmail, like Google Maps, like Google Plus installed, and those will follow pretty strictly our guidelines. And so if they start installing apps from market that aren't using the same sets of patterns, the same sets of visual language that they're already accustomed to after a day or maybe a couple of hours of use for the rest of their OS, they're going to be either confused, or they're going to start already feeling that feeling of kind of like, what is this, or what exactly is this app trying to tell me, or how am I supposed to use it? So really, the app is really a guest in the in the house that is the the user's phone. So really, you just have to respect that as a developer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the key things that any developer needs to keep in mind when they're building something on a platform is that you almost certainly will not be the most important app that someone has installed. Probably won't be in the top 5. And so to make sure that people understand how to use your application and don't feel frustrated when they do so, that's why it's really useful to be consistent with the way that the platform works, because that's how people are going to be trained to use the platform is through the apps which are already there. So it's great to be creative and to have innovative user experience, but it needs to be consistent with the way that the rest of the platform works. Otherwise, you're just going to frustrate people. And the last thing you want is for your app to feel like a foreigner on their phone. It should just feel like it's always been there. It always should have been there, and they couldn't imagine it not being installed. The new design page, this is from Gabrielle in Berlin. The new design page and the normal Android developer page tell us to optimize for different densities. Some Android apps, like the calendar, don't include LDPI resources. Is there a particular reason for that?
Well, I think one of the primary reasons is when you look at how many LDP devices are out there on the market. The numbers are quite small. So I think that from our end, the question is about resources. So LDPI, as our technology is moving forward, as Android's ecosystem is changing, and we're supporting devices with higher densities, we've introduced a new density with the Nexus Prime, or I'm sorry, the Galaxy Nexus, and that's XHDPI. So if you've developed or done any sort of visual design on Android, you know that there are a lot of resolution buckets you have to be paying attention to. LDPI being the lowest resolution we have available. So we don't include that in the packages because just the percentage of devices that we use that are activated in the market are incredibly small.
And I think as well it comes down to looking what your assets look like. So if you're going to upscale, it's almost always going to look worse. So you want to include those assets. Downscaling, sometimes the effect isn't going to be significant enough that you need to actually build a new asset for that.
I think we've found that the system scaling at LDPI assets, like you said, as you're downsampling, it's cleaner.
Yeah, so it's definitely one which, we do definitely recommend that you do so, but it's more so for upscaling and for downscaling. Have a look what it looks like, and it gives you an opportunity to optimize if you need to, but there's no need to duplicate work if you don't need to do that. I noticed we've got a couple of people join us on the live stream. Do either of you guys have questions that you'd like to ask us?
Yes, in connection with the multiple resolutions, when we bundle an APK with multiple resolutions and install it on, say, a high HDPI device, do all the other assets get deleted so that space can be made for other applications?
Yeah, so that doesn't actually happen. So an APK, once it's installed on the device, is basically untouched, unless there's anything we do with moving to SD card, which I don't think we modify the APK. But yeah, the APK basically is left untouched. So that is one of the things that may increase your file size, your APK size, is if you bundle every single asset at every single density. In many cases, it's okay to let the framework do scaling for things like LDPI, and looking at the I guess the pie chart, the distribution of how many devices with Android Market have HDPI screens versus XHDPI screens. As that changes, that'll probably influence both your decisions as well as ours as to what we package into the OS, as well as, well, actually the OS is different, but what we package into the apps. So I'd say that definitely MDPI is important. XHDPI is very important for Galaxy Nexus. I personally, just my personal hope is that at some point it'll be XHDPI and MDPI, and designers can allow scaling from XHDPI to HDPI. That would be my personal hope, but for now I think those three density buckets are probably the three most important.
And also keep checking back with your developer dashboard where you have visibility to the top access devices, and you can make refinements based on that intelligence.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because what you find is that distribution of device densities is not consistent across countries. So in some countries, LDPI devices are more popular than they are in, say, the largest markets like America and Japan. So if you do have an app which you're targeting specifically users in the UK or Australia or anywhere else, you may find that distribution is different. So it's really important once you do launch to keep track of that dashboard and bundle the resources accordingly.
Thank you.
No problem. Did anyone else on the live stream have a question they'd like to ask? Okay, we'll continue on the moderator questions. Let's have a look. So, how much should the bottom action bar be used? Is having two options in an overflow menu in the top action bar no longer recommended, and instead we should show all the actions in the bottom bar? What's the guidance for how many things to put in the action bar and where to put them?
So it's a little bit of a balancing act of your overall screen layout and the importance of your actions. So generally, your your main purpose is to show data in the content area of your app. But at the same time, you have particularly important actions that you want to surface for the user to use. So the style guide actually has some guidance there around the FIT scheme. And FIT is an acronym for frequent, important, and typical. So if you look at all your actions that you want to put into the action bar, and you apply the logic of the scheme, you surface certain really important actions that you want the user to have access to immediately without going to the action overflow. If you have a lot of those actions, and Gmail is actually a good example for that, makes sense to break out the actions into a bottom action bar and be able to show more actions side by side. If you look at an application like Gallery, for example, Gallery, at least in our design thinking, didn't have a lot of those really high-level, front and center functionalities that needed to be surfaced in the action bar. It was more, we thought that sharing was the most important access that we wanted to offer along with the image content. So there, a lot of the actions actually went into the overflow, and we didn't have a bottom action bar because everything neatly fit into the main action bar. So it's really depending on how many really front and center actions you want to present to your user in order to make the decision if you want to break them out into a bottom action bar.
Nice. Let's have a look. So this is a question about the new Maps app. So I don't know if you guys will be able to answer specifically, but DL asks that he noticed that the tablet version of Maps didn't get the new quick access dropdown /spinner. They were wondering why. I guess not being part of the Maps team may not be the right people to answer that, but he asks, is the spinner pattern, or maybe offline, is the spinner pattern discouraged on tablet layouts in general? So I'll let you try and answer. I'm going to check to see whether that's online.
I can't speak to the maps.
I think we're still online, by the way.
Yeah.
I can't speak to maps specifically. Jens, do you want to speak to spinners in tablet?
I mean, spinners versus tabs in the action bar. And I believe that this question is about the action bar, I suppose. Usually we make the distinction between tabs and spinners in terms of, how frequent and important is my view change. So, for example, there are apps that frequently and consistently give the user the opportunity to switch view. So the calling app is an example for that. Right? So the different facets of the calling application, such as the dial pad, the recent calls, and the favorites, people pivot between those quite frequently. So we have tabs there, front and center in the action bar. Spinners are more for, and Gmail again is a good example for that, where we want to make view changes accessible, but where those view changes are not very frequent. Right? So you usually don't want to pivot between all your different email accounts. You just concentrate on one, and then after a while switch to the other, and that's what the spinner is really good for. So we don't discourage that at all on tablet.
So it's really more about the information and relative importance of your different displays rather than the form factor of the device.
Yeah.
And would you say that generally speaking, is there that sort of same principles hold true for using the bottom action bar or the split action bar on devices? Like, do we discourage or encourage having that rather than sort of lots of things in the overflow menu rather than?
Again, it really depends on how important you think the actions are. to be displayed front and center for the user, but the user to be accessible all the time without having to go to the action overflow.
All right. So it's really sort of the speed of access versus the fact that you're taking up a significant amount of the screen.
Gmail is a really good example, right? So we feel search is really important for email. Creating a new email is really important. What else do we have in there?
Labeling.
Access to labels is really important because it basically gives you access to your folder structure for a particular account. So, we didn't want to hide any of those in the action overflow menu, so that's why we made the choice to, surface them constantly in the bottom action bar, rather than having to make the trade-off to bury some of them.
That makes sense.
In an app like Gmail or email, it's a very productivity-focused app, and you are frequently doing a lot of different things to that list view. That list view is multi-select, so you're quickly selecting different messages and applying those changes very quickly. So, like Jan said, in applications where you may be applying a lot of different types of action to the content that you have on the page, it makes sense. In other cases, it might make less sense if the content on your page is something that's not going to be actioned upon on a regular basis. Maybe it makes more sense to have that content come forward and take over that real estate, have a more experiential overall sort of look and feel to your app.
Nice.
And you're also more independent of different screen sizes in terms of your action layout. So on a larger screen size, you might be able to surface more actions in the main action bar. But as soon as you rotate the screen or the whole thing gets displayed on a smaller screen, some of your really important actions then go automatically into the overflow. And if you really think that those actions should always be accessible, put them in the bottom action bar. That's perfect. Cool.
Would you say that there are certain actions which should sort of always be available in the action bar? I'm thinking, I guess, to lead the question further, I'm thinking in terms of search and share. They seem to me to be pretty critical.
Search and share, and also create new, particularly at the top level of the application. Search in order to cut down on navigation hierarchy as well, because it lets you find data quickly without having to go, navigate down the entire data hierarchy. And creating new content, which is key in most apps, right? So surface those is a good idea as well.
Yeah, search is definitely one which I hope a lot of developers are thinking about, because it really can have a dramatic impact on the usability of your app, just making it so much easier to find something rather than having to drill down in content, which every extra click is a pain. So yeah. See, this is a question on the compatibility package. So we say that Luke from Dallas says that the compatibility package support library has fragments and has a view pager, but it doesn't have an action bar. So are there any plans to add it? So again, we can't sort of comment on things which haven't already been released. I think Diane Hackborn from the framework team mentioned that the action bar is a little more tricky than some of the other things which we've already introduced to the compatibility library. So I imagine it's something we would like to do. Whether it's going to happen and how difficult that is not for me to say. Generally speaking, though, we like the action bar pattern. Obviously, it's something we want to move forward with. Do you guys have any suggestions? I guess it goes a little bit back to the earlier question on backwards compatibility, but is it worth implementing your own action bar? Is that a pattern which we'd like to see people using on apps prior to Ice Cream Sandwich?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very strong opinion there, but I mean, everybody has their own opinions on pre-Ice Cream Sandwich, because pretty much, we didn't have as strong guidance as we do now, and a lot of opinions are out there. But I mean, my personal opinion is that it is definitely worth it. I think that there's good tooling now to create a custom action bar pre-Honeycomb. Action Bar Sherlock by Jake Wharton is one of them. We have an official, very basic example called Action Bar Compat, which shows you how to kind of get started. But I personally think it's definitely worth it. But the most important thing is that if you do create a custom action bar, for pre-Honeycomb devices or pre-ICS devices, make sure that you do still use the formal Action Bar API in Honeycomb or ICS. So that example that I mentioned, Action Bar Compat, shows you how to do that, how to switch between a custom implementation and the formal implementation depending on API level.
I think it's an important point to mention as well is that we were pushing the Action Bar pattern well before there was an Action Bar implementation in the framework. If you look at a lot of the sample code, particularly things like the I/O scheduling app from last year, which Jerome and Toby played a big part in, they all use this same sort of dashboard for the front page Action Bar within each activity pattern. So it's pretty well established and definitely something that users pre-Ice Cream Sandwich and Honeycomb are going to be familiar with. It's just a little bit more work to implement. A follow-up from last week's questions. DL asks, what categories of app are each of the Holo themes suited for? When should they use Holo Light? When should you use Holo Light Dark Action Bar?
So we specifically avoided trying to have any sort of I don't know, semantic relationship between when to use light, when to use dark, when to use dark action bar and Holo Light. We wanted to kind of leave that up to the developer. And what we can say about it is, the way I think about the theme is that this is sort of a good baseline for your brand or whatever the app is you're working on. I think there's a lot of influences that could drive which way you would want to go there. There's some benefits to the Holo Dark app in that the background or the action bar is transparent, the background shows through. So there's a lot of opportunities for customization and creating your own background that content lives on top of. It's a good branding experience. So, and then when looking at Holo Light, at least when we've used it, it's been in a lot of text-heavy situations where you want maximum legibility. It's great for list views, but also it's just to give some flexibility for developers to kind of start their design process, with a blank slate and say, who are we as a brand? What out of the box best describes who we are as a brand, what we're trying to shoot for, what sort of content will our app provide. You'll notice that a lot of our gallery, our photo applications tend to be dark. The images tend to pop a little better on the dark. So it just depends. There's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way with the theming. I think it's just it goes back to what you're looking for in your app, who you are as a brand, and how you really want to divide up the space. Do you want the action bar to kind of blend seamlessly into the app as it does in the Light? Do you want the action bar to really contrast from the page content? So in SMS or messaging on the app where you Holo Light with dark action bar, our primary page content is light background, dark text, very good for scanning. But in the action bar where you have your view control for changing accounts or for your actions, you've got a lot more contrast there. It sort of steps outside of the content area of your app and creates more of a strong visual separation between the spaces. So it's basically for flexibility and to try to start from a place where it makes sense for your app to start it.
It also depends on the particular data that you're displaying, right? So what could be a good guidance is that you prototype both on Holo Dark, Holo Light, and see what gives you the best visual impact for your app.
Yeah, and speaking from the perspective of content, so for the specific content of market, we have a sort of a mix of image-rich and text-rich content. So when you are on the landing page of the overall market and when you go to the specific media vertical like apps, movies, music, books, you have a lot of content driven by big images. So like it was mentioned, these look better on a dark background. And then when you go to the details page where you go to top paid lists or whatnot or the categories, these are mainly driven by text. So that switches back to being dark text on a light background. And so within that context, within the kind of the visual language, our designers saw that we should be using hollow light with a dark action bar to create kind of this separation, especially if you go to the details page. The title, the kind of the summary up on the top, it stays fixed, it doesn't scroll away. So we wanted to highlight the importance of that section, and that section has dark background. So having a dark action bar, which also is pinned on the screen, provides this kind of a nice visual language, what is more important and what is less important in the context of kind of like what scrolls away and what stays on the screen. So once again, it's completely driven by the content that you are presenting and the visual separation that highlights the hierarchy of that content.
So it's really just about the content and completely irrespective of the kind of app. So I guess some apps are going to fit into the category of displaying certain kinds of content, but that's really the overarching factor. That's interesting. Next question is, what's your stance on, next question's changed, but I'm going to go with the previous next question. What's your stance on cross-platform design? How far do you think, how far should you put patterns, if at all? I have an opinion on this, but I'd be interested to know what you guys think before I dive in. So I'm guessing cross-platform here is, should an app look the same on Android, on iPhone, on Windows Mobile, on the web, etc.?
I mean, I think this is definitely subjective. My personal feeling is that the closer your app, the closer your company is to creating a consistent and straightforward approach, or I think, how do I put it? I'm a fan of consistency, but there are areas where you kind of have to be knowingly break those rules. And I think when there are certain patterns on other platforms that I think you might twist around, but maybe have Jens or Roman speak to this a little more than I.
So I think it goes back to, if you understand an OS as a language, try to speak the language of the OS in your particular app. If you look at the pure Android chapter, it gives you some guidance on where we feel the important elements are that you should keep in mind when you write for Android. So, for example, what's bothersome is to take UI elements from other platforms and mimic them in Android. The reason for that is that Android has a broad set of UI elements available for use, and you find a good replacement for pretty much any UI element from another platform in its native Android form. And in order for your app not to stand out in a bad way, it's good practice to follow the platform conventions throughout. Also for icons, also for, we talked about right pointing carrots. So try to speak the OS language in your app in order to sort of provide a really consistent platform experience for the user. As Roman said before, sort of the OS builds the house, and you should be a good tenant in that house with your app.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've always found that what's interesting is tends to be the only person who's using your app on multiple mobile phone platforms is the people building the app, because they're doing that to test it. People at home, with the exception of people like folks in this room, tend to have one smartphone. And so they don't care whether it works and looks exactly the same on their iPhone and on their Android phone and on their Windows phone, because they only have one of them. What they care is that the app is consistent with the other apps which they're using every day. So while having things like consistent branding and sort of an overall design and user experience across each of your platforms makes a lot of sense, I think it's more important to make sure that it fits in really, really well with the rest of the ecosystem which each app is a part of.
I do want to make another point. so Nate, you mentioned consistency, across platforms. There's definitely something to be said there, right?
I guess let me rephrase that.
Sure.
So from a pattern perspective, from an interaction design perspective, I am 100% in agreement with all you guys in that. Stick with the language of the OS. I'm speaking more from if you're approaching it from a branding, from a visual design aspect, where a user might have some sort of brand exposure through the web, through marketing, through iPhone, through Android, from whatever that place is. My suggestion would be to, from a visual design perspective, have a consistent brand story in color palette, in texture, and as much as you can in typography across platforms. But in terms of scale, all of those things I think are important for consistency across platform. But from a pattern, from an interaction design standpoint, I completely agree. You got to be doing what's right on the OS.
And there's one thing that I wanted to, the reason I wanted to mention this one thing is that I recently came across a great example of where it just completely breaks all of our rules, and I personally liked it. This one example is this app called Hipmunk. Basically, the idea is that they have this kind of really unique, neat interaction on the web, where basically they present a set of results in a very special way. It's not just a list of results. It's kind of like this two-dimensionally panning timeline almost of airline flights. And just taking that and porting it to straight Android would be, it would make sense, and users would immediately understand that. But part of the the uniqueness of the app, of their brand, is that results page, is presenting it in a very specific way. So I mean, if there's something about your app that is just extremely unique, even, whether it be a visual design component or even an interaction, if it's just like even like as simple as an animation, then you want to make sure that you present that in the right light in terms of your brand to the user when they come to Android from, say, your website. So there's definitely a balance. There's no black and white answer.
Yeah, there was also. Sorry, go ahead.
There's also, I would think, the difference between a strategic approach to your app versus a tactical approach. So what Roman mentioned is, very much a strategic approach, how I will lay out my data in a very unique way in order to distinguish myself from other apps and in order to establish a brand identity. And that is actually something that we think is very welcome. And if you look at the app structure pattern, that goes into some detail on finding interesting ways of laying out your data in order to establish a unique identity for your app. But then there are the tactical things, which then go down to not the general idea and the general navigation of your app, but the exact UI elements that you use. And there you should really try to speak the OS language in order to have a consistent experience with other apps on the phone.
Yeah, so the example that I wanted to mention, I read it a few months ago from the lead Android developer working on the Square app, which is for point of sales where you come and you swipe your credit card and you effectively pay from that app. So the app there is not running on the user's phone. The app there is running on the merchant's phone. So they do want the app to look exactly the same on iOS and Android, because the user doesn't really care if the app looks consistent with the rest of that phone. What they do want to do is not to scare the user away with an unfamiliar UX and UI experience. So no matter where he goes to, if the merchant is using an iOS device or an Android device, they want to provide the same experience for the user, even though it's running on a merchant's phone. So that's also an interesting kind of set of considerations.
That's actually a really good point. I guess that's the thing you need to figure out is where is that consistency? And if it's on the merchant phone, you want to have that user consistency across different merchants rather than the different apps. It's really not about using different apps. It's an interesting, it's an interesting edge case. And I have one more question from moderator, and then I'll ask you guys something separately. So the last question is, UI guidelines to action bar icons conflict with what Google is shipping. So the guidelines say use 48 by 48x HDPI asset, but the SDK uses 64 by 64. Which should we use?
Okay, I can answer that. So I'm trying to pull up the guidelines right now to confirm what Jens is reading here. What should be the case is that all action bar icons should be 32 by 32 dips. So in XHDPI, that is 64 by 64 pixels, and in HDPI, it's 48 by 48 pixels. The guideline should be 32 by 32 dips, and that's it.
I do want to add on to something because I was the one that wrote the 48 by 48 incorrectly. But basically, the difference.
Roman's fault.
It's all my fault. You can just blame me. But the difference there is in the padding. Basically, there's an extra padding in that 32 by 32 dip. I think it's 4 dip on each side. I'm not doing math right, but that's what it accounts to. So basically, in the developer guidelines, we say don't use padding. But in the Android design guidelines, we say include the padding. So that's something that we'll fix. That's a known bug. So we'll make sure that those are matched up.
Yeah. So we used to say for launcher icons we would have padding. We remove the padding out of launcher icons, but the action icons still do have padding. So for what it's worth, the optical dimensions of the glyph, within that asset are about 24 by 24 dips. So in XH, it would be 48 by 48 pixels of the actual visual glyph itself, and then there is that additional 4 dips of padding around that. So a little confusing. We've got fixed.
Yeah, generally speaking, the design guidelines are the newest thing which we've put out. So if there is a contradiction, that's the more likely to be correct. And so we're going to go through and make sure we capture any and all bugs related to sort of contradictions there. So if you do spot them, let me know, and we can make sure there's a bug filed against that and get it fixed. So we're almost out of time. We've got a minute to go. I'm going to put you guys on the spot and ask, what are 1 or 2 apps which you've seen, third-party apps, which you think are great examples of something which uses the right Android guidelines? So if someone was to go out and see, well, what's something which someone other than Google has done, which is done in the right way?
I'm going to defer and quickly check my phone.
Please check your phone.
Because there's always new apps.
That's right. The favorite is always the newest.
Let's see what I've been running lately. Good example of our design.
Well, in the meantime, I really liked TweetDeck. When it first came out, it had a really good use of swipeable views between your different timelines and direct mentions and whatnot, and a nice these kind of small circular indicators where you are, and using the yellow highlights for new content. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they were acquired by a much bigger company, and they no longer kind of pursue that. So that was my. I still use it as my primary Twitter client on my phone.
There's one that I want to point out, Remember the Milk, which is a to-do list app. One of the things that they recently added, they added a bunch of different things, but one of the things they added was contextual action bar support. I think it was a custom implementation of contextual action bar, but they basically moved away from the checkbox multi-select and then have a bottom bar, and they moved towards the kind of the contextual action bar which you see in an ice cream sandwich. So I mean that's just one thing that I found. They have a bunch of other things that they added too, but yeah.
Very nice. Did you find anything on there that's your favorite?
What I will say is, Android design is quite new. So I think there are a lot of folks who are probably now in the process of updating their apps or creating new apps that are using some of these patterns. There's nothing that's coming to mind right off the top of my head of something that I'm using on a regular basis that is making good use of it.
So what you're saying is there's a huge opportunity.
Yes,
for developers.
that's exactly what I'm saying.
At the same time, when you use good apps, you don't notice that they have good. Sometimes you notice they have good UIs, but when they just work and they just, you just end up doing your job and doing whatever you want to do with the app, it kind of just fades away. I mean, it's almost like it's almost like a curse. You know, the better apps are, the less people talk about, less people talk about it. So, I don't know, maybe that's just a disincentive to make good-looking apps, but I don't know.
It's a funny thing. I find the same thing. Like I'll go through to create a list of my favorite apps on Android, and I'll create it, and I'll go back and look at my phone and realize I've missed the ones I use the most frequently. I don't really think of them as apps. It's just part of my phone.
Yes.
So it's what you want to get. I guess it's the trade-off in the same way when your trademark becomes just a generic name for something like Kleenex or Coke or whatever. You run the same risk for apps, but it's good when your app becomes a verb. So create the right UI, and that's a big way to get in.
So we have taken the same approach to designing apps for all platforms, since we have to target Android and iOS at the same time. What we've done is start with a design that we like, and then where we need to have settings, for instance, to be different on the iOS platform versus the Android, we fork and then vary there. But we try to keep our user experience the same, because training material and users are hopping from one device to the other. So we try to have one design for our applications fully, so that people can move around applications and things like that. So you should check out our Trimble Outdoors newly redesigned apps. I think we've taken some of the patterns that you were talking about, quick action bar, and copying some of the good stuff that we have come across. So.
Thanks for the tip. We'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, and thanks for all the new guidelines. We're loving those.
Great, very cool.
Alright, that takes us after 3 o'clock, so it's time for us to split. Thank you everyone who participated in the live hangout, and to everyone who watched on the broadcast as well. And
thanks, guys.
We'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Kirill, for joining.
Yeah, thanks.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.